Our guest tonight began her journey into filmmaking at the age of 19 when she worked under the tutelage of acclaimed director Peter Greenway, eventually acting as a second assistant director on his film Prospero's Books, and as an art director on The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. Documentary work followed, including a highly respected piece on Danish director Lars von Trier. Her first feature-length documentary effort was Hoover Street Revival, an examination of a Pentecostal church community in South Central Los Angeles. Her new film is called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, and it's inspired raves from festival audiences and critics around the globe. The picture follows Slovenian philosopher and psychoanalyst Slavoj Zizek as he navigates through an exhilarating roster of some of our most beloved films, and in the process attempts to uncover what they say about our deepest desires and our darkest fantasies. Along the way, movie lovers have an opportunity to savor invaluable and interesting insights into the works of Hitchcock, David Lynch, Charlie Chaplin, Stanley Kubrick, Andrei Tarkovsky, Francis Coppola, David Fincher, and many others. It is our pleasure to welcome to the show the co-editor, co-producer, and the director of Pervert's Guide to Cinema, Sophie Fiennes. Sophie, are you there?
I'm there. Hi, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here in London. Hello.
It's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
No, it's my pleasure. I've enjoyed listening in to the tail end of your previous conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. I wanted to start, first of all, I saw this movie a couple of weeks ago at the Sarasota Film Festival, and I was just blown away. It was so stimulating and it's so entertaining and enjoyable, and it just gave you a whole new level of appreciation for these great films. I certainly want to talk about your film, but first of all, I want to start out. You worked for 4.5 years with Peter Greenway, is that correct?
Yes, I did. I mean, as you were saying, I started at 19, and I'd seen his Eden Two Noughts when I was like about 17, and I was at art school, and I was really struck by the way that he'd constructed the film. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to his producer, who was looking for a runner. And I became like a production runner on The Belly of an Architect, and then met Peter, and he realized that I was gunning for him, so and interested in what he was doing. So I had a very lucky break in that I was able to work for 4.5 years on feature films from Drowning by Numbers, which I was the location manager on. Although at that stage, because the unions were very strong in the UK, I couldn't be credited as location manager. But it was all shot in an area of England which is called Suffolk on the East Coast. And I'd never worked on a film in my life, let alone being the location manager on a feature. So it took years off my life, I think, because it was very hair-raising. We even had a hurricane which raised the location to pulp. But it was an amazing immersion into the practical side of filmmaking, and also working with someone like Peter Greenway. He was a sort of real author, an auteur in the true sense of the word, developing his own film language. And so I had a great way of breaking into making films, because there's a huge amount of practical knowledge that you need to gather, because there are so many different stages to film production. So I really valued that experience.
What were some of the things that you took away from him and kind of helped to inform who you are as an artist, do you think?
Well, I think I saw him take a lot of risks, and I saw him follow what he really wanted to do against the odds, and in the face of criticism, and and sometimes criticism can leave some people unable to make a film for years and years. And he always, his instinct for what he wanted to do, always allowed him to rise beyond any apparent failures. And also, there was a practical side to it. I mean, when I started making my own films, although the Pervert's Guide to Cinema is an ideas film, and in that sense, I think there was an interest in Peter as a filmmaker who makes films that are ideas orientated. Yeah. Like, he sort of talks of his characters as being signposts to ideas, and that's one of the reasons why people feel that he's sort of dehumanizing as a filmmaker. He doesn't. There's not this kind of warmth that people look for in cinema. But I feel that my films are quite different in their tone, but they are ideas orientated. And So I think, I enjoyed working with him and knowing that it's possible to make, to make cinema and films that are full of ideas.
Well, I've read or I heard an interview that you did with the BBC, I believe, where you said that you don't consider yourself a documentary filmmaker, at least not in the traditional sense. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean by that I have absolutely no journalistic background. All of my experiences. Well, I did a foundation course at art school course, and then I started working with Peter, who's obviously making, fiction and very visually orientated, aesthetic filmmaking. And so the idea of, what I imagine learning to do to make documentaries might be about, if I had learned, it would be about kind of social theory or anthropology, journalism, documenting truths, getting behind the facade, whereas most of my films are interested in appearance, which is why I like Slavoj's theories around the nature of appearance.
Mm-hmm.
When I made Who the Street Revival, I was more interested in the symbolic role that the pastor had in his community, and lots of people criticized me for not interviewing him. But for me, an interview is like this, is where I'm having to PR myself, I'm having to consider how I'm going to present myself, whereas if you could see me now in my flat and just observe me standing here, on a Sunday night, you'd have a very different sense of maybe of what you would see of me as if you were to observe me than how I'm able to speak about what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's a difference for me in, what happens when you observe, when you put a camera on things. They sort of become different. The frame on life changes life, and it becomes something other. It becomes, possibly cinema. It certainly becomes, boxes of videotapes. But in the end, I think that my background has been, the films that I've looked at have all been fiction films since I was 19, and many of the films in The Pervert's Guide to Cinema. So in that sense, I'm coming from a background which is orientated towards fiction and not documentary. But having said that, there are documentary filmmakers like Fred Wiseman, who, I find his work fascinating, but my knowledge is very limited in documentary.
Well, speaking of Zizek, how did you happen upon his work, and what about it spoke to you and made you realize that this could be your next film?
Well, I was doing research, and I sort of was interested in this relationship between fiction and reality, or documentary as opposed to drama, or what it is that is the function of storytelling as opposed to documenting the world, making documents. Because I certainly, love the process of making a document, and in a sense, I tried to make a document of Zizek's ideas on cinema, on the one hand, with making this film. So I was interested in this relationship between storytelling and documenting, and it seems like that, and also this question of really a kind of very rich thinking, intellectually challenging mind gym that Slavoj presents us with. When you read his books, you're taken on a kind of mental assault course, and you're sort of hung upside down and suddenly see things in a different way, and it's really invigorating. So the more I read, the more excited I was by how he was looking at cinema, because it was something that I've been looking at, since I was at art school.
Yeah.
So, I was just excited it was a way to kind of go into it beyond just reading the books. It was a way to actually explore it through the medium that I work in, which is film. So it was testing these theories on the actual films that he's talking to, and seeing what happens to the theories and what happens to the films by putting them against each other.
I think that this is definitely a film that belongs in any movie lover's library. It's essential.
It's very nice that it's been having such a good response, because in a sense it's for me the output of a kind of research for myself, and so in that sense it's nice that if you do a kind of project that's you have a personal excitement for, and then you realize that kind of excitement and that way of thinking is actually shared by a lot of people.
Oh yeah, and I think the first thing that obviously struck me when I saw it on the festival schedule Obviously, I was taken by the title. And you said that the title is somewhat of a MacGuffin, but you can read it as somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but after seeing the film, it seems to make perfect sense somehow. How does that title speak to the content of the film for you?
Well, yeah, and I think what you're saying is true. I sort of agree with it. I mean, I think that actually, fundamentally, it's a very appropriate title for the film. But, it became clear to me that for those who don't kind of, read psychoanalytic theory, the word pervert means something very, very simple, whereas actually it's a pathology that's explored much in psychoanalytic thought. So, and of course, the relationship between viewing and the effect of viewing simulations of reality on us is a kind of pervert practice in a sense. It's of course it's a very relevant title, but it also is a way to make people stop and think. And if I had said, Slavoj Zizek, psychoanalytic theories on cinema, the film might not have made people see it in a list of other films. So, in a way, I was, creating the title. Just these things just come to you, kind of instinct. For me, anyway, it just came to me as a title, kind of out of the blue. And I thought, yeah, that means that if I get this film commissioned by the UK TV broadcaster, I will address all their needs for attracting an audience.
Yes.
And behind the title, I can make the kind of challenging, provocative, thought-provoking film that I want to make, because the title will do all of the kind of necessary stuff of attracting attention.
Oh, yeah. It definitely attracted my attention. So the structure of the film, it's separated into three parts. Essentially, it's Zizek analyzing different moments from over 43 films, and at times actually going into the world of the films, whether it's through set recreation or going to the actual locations in which these films take place. It seemed like a difficult thing to gauge. Was it scripted, or did you outline the scenes at all? The
thing about having kind of been making my own work as opposed to working with Greenway, as my own work has been documentary, the thing about making documentaries is that you don't really define things in advance too much.
Right.
You have a kind of a question and you have a quest. So then you create material, but you create it with definite questions. So those questions generate a certain framework, that you're following, and then you end up with a lot of material. So, I definitely had certain films that I was very much wanting to represent because I liked the series, and sometimes I just so liked the series that I kind of had to have them in because they were, they were just sort of compelling ideas. They're kind of sometimes almost revelations if you've never come across them before. And then in other moments, Slavoj would just come up with material that I hadn't planned with him. And that was very exciting because it was stuff that I'd never heard before. And what was nice about it was that because I made these reconstructions of sets from the films, this kind of seemed to generate certain points that he wanted to make. So it was like setting a stage, literally, or setting a scene. And within that, he then, almost in a sense, he's like a jazz musician who knows the instrument that he's playing, and he knows how to come up with different kinds of sounds, as it were. So, he would suddenly come up with material that I hadn't, planned, but that was, those moments of, in the shooting was very exciting. And then, I spent 9 months editing it.
My reaction, I'm sure, was like everyone else in the theater. There's so many films that you feature. It just made me want to go out and pick up all those films again and watch them, because you would feel like you could watch them from a whole new perspective. How'd you go about choosing? You said that there's some that you fought for, and was it difficult getting all those clips together?
Yeah, it was a lot of work, and a lot of, that's why the editing took a lot of time, and it's also, incredibly, delicate how to unfurl the thinking, the Zizek thinking. So, even just to sort of allow people to see, like, a moment in a Chaplin film, to wait for the next point to be made, to time it very carefully so that people can comprehend the images and the intent of the film and what the film's doing, and then his point about how to look at it. So he's giving you these clues of how to see, like this end sequence of City Lights, the Chaplin film, just getting the sort of sense of the delivery was, it's amazing how a few frames here, a few frames there can just make it clearer or not. So a lot of the process of working with the clips and with the series is really to try to get the thing as clear as possible. It's about trying to make the ideas connect as immediately with the audience as possible.
There's just so many great films that are represented here, and I think I want to get into those films and his thoughts on it and your thoughts on them. I think it's fair to say that there seems to be a particular emphasis on the films of Hitchcock and Lynch.
Yeah, I mean, he's written a lot about Hitchcock and David Lynch. He's a huge Lynch fan. So these are two sort of masters of cinema that he's worked particularly on, and he wrote a whole book, or he actually edited a whole book with essays by different people and some, by himself, called Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Hitchcock but were too afraid to ask Lacan. And that's a wonderful book to read to get his ideas on Hitchcock. He wrote a special essay on David Lynch called The Art of the Ridiculous Sublime, which is about Lost Highway. And then there's also, other the Lynch films that he's referring to in many of his other books. I think if you want to read the starter book on his ideas on cinema, it's really Enjoy Your Symptom. That would be a book to start on, which is all about cinema.
What do you think it is about these two directors specifically that kind of makes sense for this kind of exploration?
Well, I think that it's clear from the film that the sort of Lacanian way of looking at images can be understood through these films, because the language of a Lynch film and the way that the themes that he's exploring, whether it's these obscene fathers, the repetition of certain motifs of male characters that recur in Lynch's films, or whether it's his fascination with female sexuality or female subjectivity. This is also the big area in Hitchcock, the kind of Hitchcock blonde, what happens to the women in Hitchcock. And, part of it for me as a woman, is as a woman fascinated by the kinds of narratives that men create, and that form the whole of cinema, arguably 99% of it, to actually have a way to look at it through this lens, is great. And I think these two filmmakers go into this kind of thorny area. If you've seen Inland Empire, it's a film it's all about this predicament of, as it says, it's a film about the women in trouble. So in that sense, if sexuality is the kind of recurring traumatic field for human beings, then the filmmakers who actually go in a kind of daring way, or even in a sort of playful, somewhat kinky way, as Hitchcock does, then they become, the films that they make become great opportunities to understand how relationships between men and women might be working. Yeah.
I was very pleased. I'm such a movie geek, especially about Lynch films.
Yeah.
My favorite film is actually Wild at Heart.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just over the moon to see that represented in your film. Specifically, the scene that's explored in that one is the Bobby Peru Lula scene.
Yeah.
What kind of deductions did he make from that particular scene?
Well, this is a scene that he writes about a lot, and in fact, he says more about it than was possible to include in the film. But fundamentally, what he says about this famous scene where Bobby Peru forces Laura Dern to ask him to fuck her, and then at the moment which she says okay, then he says, I'm sorry, actually, do you know what, maybe not now, thanks very much, bye. So what he does is that he forces her to announce her fantasy, and then he leaves he walks away from it. And this is what Slavoj refers to as a mental rape, which is that to rather than to impose the act without the fantasy, here he evokes the fantasy but doesn't pass to the act. So he leaves her feeling humiliated. And this is a kind of a mental rape, pulling out the fantasy from the woman, but not actually completing the act.
Yeah.
But there's not much more that you can read about what he says about this scene and how Bobby Peru functions. We revisit Bobby Peru in part 3 of the film, and he's one of these obscene fathers, one of these kinds of overpotent, kind of outrageously, over-libidinally alive male characters that Lynch's films are full of. And there's this whole question of how in Lynch's films, we pass from this reality, as it were, kind of slightly ersatz reality, that we're then moving into this overblown sort of gothic fantasy in which these very overly alive, terrifying figures exist. And then, of course, as he says, they have to be sacrificed. They die. They usually die like Frank in Blue Velvet dies. And then the point, also a point that I couldn't get in the film, which because of the sort of constraints of screen time, is this thing that Slavoj says, that there's almost a sadness when you leave this weird, terrifying nightmare world and you have to return, like in Blue Velvet or like in Wild at Heart, when the Galinda character reappears and says in this kind of phony way, "Oh, sailor, don't give up on love," and we feel like we've returned to a kind of phony, sort of controlled fantasy but beneath it there's something much more terrifying and explosive, and that's what Lynch's films really go into. Yeah. And that's what psychoanalysis goes into. So, it's no surprise that someone like Lynch is sort of doing this transcendental meditation or working in a very uncensored way with his imagination.
As I was watching the film, and particularly the Lynch clips, I was thinking, I'm wondering if you've heard from any of the obviously living directors that you profile in this film.
Well, we actually went, Slavoj and I went to LA, and at one point I was thinking to actually have interviews with some of the filmmakers, but it's so hard. I mean, I was trying to get an interview with Walter Murch, we were trying to get an interview with Lynch. We actually went all the way to LA, and then half an hour before the interview, we were told that he was sick and unable to do the interview. So that didn't happen, and in fact, Slavoj was incredibly relieved, I think, because he's such a huge fan. But I think to actually meet Lynch, and in a funny way, they sort of don't need to meet. If David Lynch is famous for not wanting to kind of analyze his films himself, and I totally understand that position. So I don't know whether it would be even of interest. And Lars von Trier, who I had also made a film about, we tried to, get a meeting with him. But I think if you're making these kinds of films, you want to keep on making them without necessarily being too aware of what it is that you're doing. You need to work probably more intuitively and, directly with your imagination. Yeah. Otherwise, you might start censoring or over-interpreting before you make the films.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film, and I want to let our listeners know how they can view the film themselves. How can they find it?
Sure. Well, the film is self-distributed by us because it was a question really as a documentary, as it were, a specialist documentary, just to simply make the film available. So, we've made it available, and it's from the film's website. You can purchase it as a DVD, and it's posted anywhere in the world for the same price. And, we're slowly getting it into bookshops. If bookshops contact us and want to stock it, we try to, we make that possible. And we're slowly working on, making it available where people want it. So, the film's website is www.thepervertguide.com, and you can get it from there.